Hey gamers. So a sentiment I see a lot in the tasking section among some of the newer members is just kind of a sense of surprise or confusion on how top level testers are able to so often find large improvements or, just constantly and quickly be able to look over files and just pick apart 2 and 3 frames all over the place. The short answer to this that they often get is just, practice and, just sticking with it. Myself personally, I've been testing for 5 years and I've picked up a ton of stuff over that time. But I'll admit that answer isn't the most helpful thing in the world. While it is obviously true that practice will get you there, there's a lot of little things that you can be told that will greatly help accelerate this process and, will get you to that point faster. Um, Again, it is absolutely true that it boils down to practice, and that is technically the correct answer, but it's not necessarily the most helpful answer. So to be clear, this guide won't be tasking 101, down to opening up Game Banana and installing all the tools, and how to use breakpoints and frame advance and all that. There are a handful of other guides that'll link in the description that go through that, but this is kind of a guide on how to level up your game from there. This is going to assume you've already made a couple of tasks and just that you understand the process and want to be able to contribute to larger projects and help out. That said, if you're in a position where you're starting out and you don't feel like you're at the point where you're ready to, contribute to larger projects, just keep at it. A big thing that you can do is to look at pre-existing files and just go through them slowly and study a bit. Why they do X and Y, things that you could pick up and apply to your own tasks, and etc. A really helpful thing as well is to pair up with somebody else. Find a level that you want to task, like a new draft or something, and get a more experienced tester to work on it with you and just kind of work through it with there. This is easier to do whenever there's a new project or a task contest going on, but you can still, people are friendly in the test journal channel and will certainly be willing to work with you. But yeah, it's just to say that process will take a while and you will make a lot of stuff that looks kind of sloppy, but everyone's been there and you just got to get through it basically. And otherwise, just to be clear, this is a bit of an informal guide. I have picked out specific examples and will be kind of scripting my way through them, but kind of expect a few ums and ahs and production issues here and there. This was just the easiest way to get the video out in a reasonable amount of time, and I still think it serves its purpose well enough. And so with all that introduction out of the way, I'm just going to kind of jump into it. There will be a lot of topics in this video that I spend a few minutes with, but otherwise, especially towards the end, it's just going to be kind of a lightning round of random stuff that I think is helpful to know, but you don't really learn it without either trial or error or somebody directly telling you. All that said, in the description, there will be timestamps to follow along if you want to use this as a future reference. And a last disclaimer I'll kind of make is that a lot of these examples are just kind of things that came to mind whenever I think of these concepts, and not necessarily every single one of these were created by myself. A lot of them come from SJ task authors, main game task authors, and so I just didn't want to leave that unsaid. I didn't want there to be an implication that everything in this video was created and optimized by me, because that just isn't the case for a lot of this. So I think the single most important advice I could give to help you start thinking in a way that helps you find improvements is to learn how to break rooms into individual pieces and then focus on optimizing those individual pieces. So for example, this room in Loopy Lagoon, there's quite a bit going on, and for a lot of new testers, I think it could be kind of overwhelming if they were to look at a room, like, not this room necessarily in particular, but a room like this, and they kind of think something like, well, this looks improvable, but I don't really know where to start. So a decent place to start would be to kind of pick like landmarks in the room as places to try and optimize to. So for example, bubbles are really good for this because whenever you enter them, it rounds your position and all that, and it gives you kind of a consistent starting point. So rather than trying to look at like every single piece of the room and think on like a super macro level, what you could instead do is look at this section of movement right here and see if you could reach this bubble sooner. In general, the spots that you pick for this should be places that are good sync points. So bubbles are great for this, dream blocks are great for this. In a lot of cases, landing on a platform is really good for this. And the final one that's generally pretty obvious and will apply to almost every single screen is screen transitions are really good for this, because they don't round your speed, or like the speed you go through them is important, but they do round your positioning when you go through them. So generally, if you have a similar amount of speed and you go through a room a frame faster, you should be saving a frame, sort of deal. So a decent example of a bottleneck comes up in 1A in this screen, where you want to reach that wooden platform in the top right corner as soon as possible. While it might be tempting to do a hyper right here to reach this up dash right here, which would look like this, and we reach the platform at 21:49 is when we start this hyper, it actually turns out it's way better to do a super here. So instead, if we do a super here, we end up jumping from this dash at a similar time, and we spend more time jumping here, but during this time we are moving up significantly more because a super makes you jump higher than a hyper. So when it's all said and done, we end up reaching this platform 21:45, saving 4 frames over the old task. And again, while it might be tempting to do that up dash as soon as possible, what actually matters here is the height, so you want to maximize that as much as possible. So one thing that produces a lot of bottlenecks is dream blocks, and a good example of it is here in 2B, where we want to go through that vertical dream block in the top right. So what I might see a lot of newer taskers do is something like this, where they dash from far back and enter it here, and this enters the dream block on the latest possible frame of the dash. So you would think in your head, you know, this is reaching this dream block as early as possible, like that's a good thing, right? Well, our goal is to reach this higher dream block up in the top right, so it's actually way better to delay our horizontal dash for as long as possible and enter the dream block from up here. So basically we're moving up, we're spending the time we would just be moving horizontally, we're moving vertically and horizontally at the same time instead, basically. And doing that gets us out of the dream block right here, and even though we're entering it just a little bit later, like maybe if 1 frame, maybe 2 frames later, it's still well worth it for saving time on all this climbing. So a big thing to understand with bottlenecks is that obviously in some cases they're not going to be contained to just one room. So here's an example of that in 2B. So through this transition, we want to do a transition wall bounce to reach this dream block sooner, and we hit it on frame 327 rather. And so if we look at where we are when we hit this transition right here, we're pretty high up in this transition. Like our position will get rounded and all that, but we obviously have a little bit of wiggle room here. So a cute thing we can actually do right here is when we pop out of this dream block, we can actually afford to wall jump here and then dash out, and we're still leaving the room on the same frame, but we're just a little bit further right without spending any extra time. And when we do this and we do the same wall bounce, the same movement as before, we're hitting the dream block 1 frame sooner. So while those 2 examples might have seemed kind of obvious, if I'm being completely honest, you could kind of boil down like close to half of my improvements to just a better understanding of a bottleneck in a room, or just doing movement that's better suited to that bottleneck than what was done previously. So I'm just going to go through a few kind of weird examples of that. For some horizontal screen transitions, you might have a bit of wiggle room before you actually go through the transition. So for example here, doing optimal movement, you would do a grounded ultra here, and you would exit the screen transition on this frame 151. But you can see we actually have a ton of positioning to work with here whenever we hit the screen transition. Like, we are so far into the screen already, and it's just going to round us and not matter. So it's actually better here to extend this extended hyper just a tiny bit more. So when we actually get there, we extend this hyper right here for 2 more frames. And then we hit the screen transition on the same exact frame. And what this does actually is it gives us the same exact speed into the next room, but we have this grounded ultra speed for an extra 2 frames, and that saves time getting into this bubble right here. And I just wanted to say that this example is incredibly important and will come up a ton while you're tasking. Like, I could find you literally hundreds of examples of this coming up. Basically, any time that you're doing a hyper bunny hop to a grounded ultra through a screen transition, that's going to come up. Basically, the easiest way to break this down is to look at the first possible frame you can go through the screen transition, and then think of how you can change your extended hyper beforehand to just maximize your speed going through while still hitting it on the same frame. This doesn't cover every single case, but it covers enough cases to where I feel like it's important to just kind of ruin the pace of the video and bring it up. Oh, also, 6-frame bunny hops also play a role in this. If you can get a 6-frame bunny hop and get a bit more speed through a screen transition, that's also really, really good. A really big concept to understand when you're optimizing
sections where Madeline is moving very, very fast is that things like random ultras or corner boosts become less and less worth it, and you really need to identify bottlenecks when you're in sections where you're moving very fast. So I think, for example, it's pretty well understood that a wake could be a lot crazier. Like, we're not really doing extra corner boost there. We're not doing a corner boost after this bunny hop here off of this platform. And the reason for all of this is that after this reverse corner boost to downright dash, which by the way, this ultra doesn't even connect because it would just be too much speed, is that when we do this upright dash, we're not colliding this frame, but we are colliding on the very next frame. And we just barely retain speed right here. And this retained speed is very important to save a bunch of time in the next screen. So that's all to say, this one corner right here ends up being the bottleneck for the entire previous like 4 or 5 screens. So all that extra speed we could build up in previous screens is not entirely free because you get stuck behind a wall for a couple of frames. And at the end of the day, we have to slow down anyway, so it's just not worth it. A decent way of thinking about it is when you add in a corner boost or something, you're basically spending a frame entirely stationary. Like, imagine you're moving really, really fast forward, and then you just completely freeze for one frame, and then you continue moving fast forward, but with, like, you know, plus 40 more speed. Once you're moving so fast that you're moving, like, multiple tiles a frame, it just doesn't really matter. It's just not beneficial anymore. So a practical example I found of this is in Strawberry Jam in JavaScript. For this boost at the end, you can do a delayed ultra and a bunch of corner boosts and stuff, so like delayed ultra, do all that, and just show it full speed. You get a lot of speed and it's really cool, but it's kind of unnecessary. The gap you want to fall down is just right there. So as it turns out, taking a much more straightforward approach just saves 4 frames. This came up in the end of Strawberry Jam Prologue too. Towards the end here, we used to do this corner boost here into an upright dash into another corner boost, which gets you a bit of extra speed, but it's a whole bunch of standing against walls completely stationary. Like here, we're completely stationary for 3 frames, and we're completely stationary here for like 2 frames or so. So the better approach is to just take the most direct path possible, and you get a bit less speed as a result, but you're moving the entire time towards your destination, which is what's important here.
So I think I've kind of beaten this point home by now, so I'm going to move on, but I'll just kind of summarize this section and say that it's really helpful to just break rooms into small pieces and not think of them entirely on a macro scale. This won't kind of cause you to cause like massive route changes to a screen where you do it entirely differently and flip everything on its head, but those circumstances are kind of rare anyway. These are going to be the majority of improvements you're going to find to anything that's pre-existing and already decently optimized. It sounds kind of weird to say, but down dashing is definitely the weakest dash direction in all of Celeste, because it's just kind of somewhat rare that you want to purely fall without worrying about any horizontal movement. And in cases like that, it's usually better to either fall using a down diagonal dash or just fall without dashing at all. It also just gets worse the closer you are to terminal velocity while falling, since down dashing will have to reset you to terminal velocity once the dash ends. And a lot of the time also, if you're falling and you want to like land and then wave dash in like ultra or something, it might just be better to save a dash when you land, so that you don't have to wait until you're grounded to start a dash. It's just not that great. It's still an option that's good in a lot of instances, but here's a few examples of better things you can do to fall. So this test is pretty unscientific, but here's just a rough comparison of down dashing versus down diagonal dashing. If I down dash here, I reach the screen transition on frame 51, and then if I change that to a down diagonal dash, I reach it at frame 55, just 4 frames later. So you can see it's not that much slower to just down diagonal dash. You can probably pretty easily imagine a scenario where down diagonal dashing can be executed sooner than a down dash could by like 4 to 5 frames, and you're saving time over it. The example of this that always sticks in my mind is right here in 2A. One of the old school strats for this section used to be this, where you would down diagonal dash into the floor, and then you would down dash, and that reaches this block, let's say at 3204. The new strat for this, though, will actually do a wall jump here, and does the down diagonal dash as late as possible to be able to clip this floor, and just start falling sooner, because it doesn't have to walk all the way over here to down dash to avoid the spike. and this will end up at the same height at roughly 7 frames faster, let's say. So you can see down dashes just like generally aren't great. There's usually a lot better options you can do, and they're usually reserved for specific circumstances. As an example in 6B that comes up in a handful of other places, whenever you're moving really fast, it can be worth just jumping really high and falling normally without dashing at all. It might be tempting to do a down diagonal dash or a down dash here, but it's just not worth it. So like, for example, by the time you reach here, you're moving at 190 speed, and if you down dash, that's 240 speed, and then you have to reset the terminal velocity, and you're just already falling at a speed to where that's just bad, just to show it in full speed. So yeah, it can be worth making a jump trajectory that lets you fall as much as possible when you reach the corner. That being said, don't reinvent the wheel. There's still a lot of places where down dashes are good. It's just typically situations where you can immediately down dash and you can't really get any vertical downward speed prior. So for example, like here, out of a grounded ultra chain, we're not really in a situation where we can get much speed going downwards, so down dash is by far the best thing we can do here. And this task is just like full of examples of places where you just want to do different kinds of falling than just down dashing. It might be tempting to down dash through a lot of these holes, but you can see like keeping a dash for something else is almost always worth it through all of these. It's just worth kind of messing around with falling. It's a weirdly hard thing to optimize sometimes, and there's a lot of weird rules for it. So one thing I noticed in a lot of first drafts is an over-reliance on stunning. I don't want to talk people out of the technique since I am generally pretty positive on it, but I do notice with a lot of new players it's a little bit of a crutch. I'd recommend saving stunning as a last resort, and you should only add it to your first draft if it very obviously just cuts like 10 seconds off the task. And if you aren't sure, generally speaking, it's probably best to do it without stunning first. Whenever I do without stunning first, I usually find that I notice like a lot of optimizations or like strats that I didn't consider otherwise, and it just saves you a bit of time for stunning. It's usually easier to add a stun than to remove a stun. That said, in the background, I'm playing a few clips of me cutting stuns from the Strawberry Jam task and straight up just saving time. I've saved close to like 6 or 7 seconds just from cutting stuns. That said, if a stun is seeming definitely optimal, there's still a lot you can do to try to optimize it. Generally, the way you will optimize a stun is by minimizing the amount of pauses, because every single extra pause is just 10 extra frames of being entirely stationary and accomplishing nothing. So here's just like a short list of some of the things you can do to cut pauses. So it might be worth trying to do as much positioning as possible before you start your stunning. So example here, a normal approach when we want to stun upwards out of the stream block is that you might just go through this, not crouch and not even think about it. But if you do this while crouched, you can actually clip the corner underneath the binocular coming up right here while crouched. And what this accomplishes is basically we've cut 2 frames of moving upwards while doing stun pauses. So if we do that movement beforehand, we don't have any extra pauses, but by doing this beforehand, we're just a little bit higher and we cut down on a pause. It comes up kind of rarely, but whenever it comes up, it's definitely something worth coming in mind, just generally like maximizing your position as much as possible before you start stunning. Something you'll want to do pretty often is build up speed in a room before, or like a section before the stun, just to do as few pauses as possible, because the faster you're moving through the object you want to stun, generally the faster you're going to get out of the hitbox and the less time you're going to spend in range of it being loaded. So for example here in Belly the Beast, we do some kind of strange movement on a screen transition, but it gets us a ton of falling speed into this stun, and it saves a ton of pauses. I think optimizations in this section saved like 2 to 3 seconds. And this is kind of impossible to show off concisely, but it might be worth just trying out changing the spinner cycle timings and pausing relative to when the stunning starts. Just kind of fiddle around with it, just change the timing of starting the stun and the cycle, and just see if it happens to save time. I'll say a lot of the time people tend to have their ducks in a row with that, especially if the task is older. But if it's a new improvement to a stun, it's always worth trying. Lastly, it might be worth just being a bit creative and just messing around with different places of stunning. It's kind of easy to get kind of pigeonholed on like, this is the optimal place to stun and it shouldn't be changed, but it's worth just kind of, tweaking around and seeing if you come up with anything new with it. I've found several stuns that weren't really removing the stun outright, but just replacing it with a stun that required significantly fewer pauses, even if it required a bit more detour. So I think probably the biggest misconception with tassing, and especially main game tassing, is that you kind of need like a perfect mathematical brain that like completely understands the source code of Celeste. Like to make any meaningful improvements these days, you got to do really tiny optimizations. You got to know like rounding errors and all that. You need to, have brute forcing algorithms and all of that. But I would encourage people to just kind of have a creative or open mind when trying strats and just kind of tinker around and just mess with things. As an example, 1A is probably the most studied task, period. It's not necessarily the most optimized, but it is like very, very studied. But that said, the 3 most recent improvements on 1A across the last year have all been new strat changes. It hasn't been really tiny, rounding errors or anything like that. It's just been straight up people trying new stuff. So I'd encourage people to do that as much as possible, even when looking at what tasks that seem really old and optimized. You can find some really surprising stuff, and if you don't directly find time save, you can give someone else an idea for time save. I think in general people are way too afraid of tassing holdables, so here's just a few small tips to help out. A number 1 tip for holdable tassing is to cut regrabs as much as possible, and whenever you're forced to do a regrab, you want to get as much out of it as possible. So it's usually a good idea to do grounded ultra cancels into holdables, and there's some cases where it's not worth all the setup, but in the grand majority of cases, as you can see in 5B, we're doing it almost everywhere we can. Basically, a large reason why grounded ultra cancels are so good is because they just cut down on the amount of times you have to regrab Theo. Even though it takes that extra time to, set up the weird looking ultras, it's worth it because it just cuts out a 12 frame long animation where you are entirely stationary and not moving at all. Something that tends to be super underutilized in throwable tasks is jump timer abuse. So for example here, we can't normally jump over this spinner from just jumping from a floor. But you can actually make this jump with some clever abuse of the jump timer in-game. So from here, whenever we do the reverse hyper, if you continue holding jump into the grounded ultra and then do the grab, and just continue holding jump, what will happen is that once this regrab ends, you'll still have the jump timer going, and the game will pop you off the floor just a little bit. And then from here, you still have coyote time, and you're still off the floor, and you can jump and get just a bit of extra height to clear this without any regrabs or any other nonsense. This comes up a ton, and is super, super underutilized. It's also just useful sometimes to do small jumps out of grounded ultras. For example, this holdable is really, really floaty, and if you do a normal full tile jump here, you just miss the spring entirely, and you have to do a regrab to do any normal movement here. But if you do jump timer abuse instead, you can just kind of float upwards into the spring. This saves 12 frames from cutting a regrab. So here's some new secret sauce with holdables that isn't entirely new, but it's starting to be applied in more places, and I think it has a lot more potential than where it's used currently. What you can do is, with jump timer abuse, you can grab the holdable and kind of pop up in the air while you neutral drop it, and then you can hit the screen transition, which you can't go through without holding the holdable. If you're familiar with super dashing, where you can gain infinite speed, this is kind of a similar idea, but you can only get 1 extra ultra. So once you get to this point in the jump timer, you can do a coyote jump here, and then once you jump high enough, you can connect an ultra, you can do 1 more jump to do a grounded ultra, and then grab the holdable and you're good to go. And this is a lot of setup, but it lets you go very, very fast, as you can see. So an upside to this is that if you have a big, wide open horizontal area in front of you, this can cut a lot of regrabs. This saves a ton of time in this section because it saves a ton of regrabs and a ton of slow movement. So it's just something to consider. Like I said, it's not entirely new, but I think it's something that can be applied in a lot more areas. This is another thing that's underutilized, and if you're doing a hyper and then grabbing a throwable, if you have low subpixels, you can actually be on the exact 4 pixel whenever you do the hyper. So I'm hypering right here, and then if I were to grab a holdable, I would be fully grounded here, and once this grab animation ends, I have coyote time and can jump. This is basically a best of both worlds situation in terms of doing like a grounded ultra cancel and doing a hyper. It is a lot less speed than a grounded ultra cancel, but it tends to be a lot less setup. And again, it's just kind of a best of both worlds in terms of getting hyper speed and also getting a full jump. This tends to be strictly better than doing a hyper B hop with a holdable. So from this point forward, it's just going to be like random miscellaneous optimizations that I see either missed or done incorrectly a lot, or just things that aren't immediately intuitive and you don't really pick up on unless somebody tells you or you just find it by accident. So it's going to be a little bit disorganized and all over the place, but I'll have timestamps in the description of everything, and it's just going to be random small examples all over the place. So I think an interaction that a lot of people know but don't apply as much as they should is that crouch jumping actually gives you a small decrease in speed. It just makes you lose a little bit of speed as opposed to uncrouch jumping. So a really good example of this comes up immediately in 1A actually. So right here, whenever you corner boost here, if you try to hit this corner boost right here without slowing down, you get dead pixeled on it basically. You don't get good speed from this corner boost. So you can't keep speed right here. So a normal approach to dealing with this that I see a lot of people do is they might try to just add a frame of neutral before the corner boost. So like right here, I do a frame of neutral to slow down a little bit. And this does in fact work, and it gets you the corner boost here, so you can keep speed right here. But you can see that the task optimally is actually jumping a frame earlier here. It's able to get just a little bit further right. So what you can actually do instead here that just barely works is that you can do this jump as a crouch jump. And when you do that, you get just a little bit less speed here. And you still connect the corner boost, and you just barely land here. If you look at the subpixel, it's just barely landing. So it's just a really small optimization thing, but there are some cases where you're slowing down where you want to try to fit in a crouch jump instead of doing a frame of neutral, just because it loses you a bit less speed than a frame of neutral. So something I see a surprising amount of people miss is that moving through one-way platforms while moving upwards actually gives you a vertical push. It's not just while dashing or anything, but while climbing in general. So while I'm inside of this one-way, if you look at the velocity, I'm moving at 105, but now that I'm inside of the platform, that gets boosted up to negative 145. So it just gives you a small little bit of just vertical boost, basically. And that applies while you're dashing, while you're jumping, or anything. So for example, I'm going to dash upwards right here. And the first frame of no control happens frame 43. But if I were to change this upwards movement pattern to where I'm doing this upwards dash and it moves me through this one-way platform to the left, so like do the same exact movement, but I do a neutral here instead of a climb jump, and then I up dash on the same frame right here, I get a couple frames of being pushed upwards by this platform, and I leave the room one frame earlier. And it's worth mentioning as well that this upwards push is dependent on Madeline's hitbox at the time. Like, while she's inside the platform physically is when she gets the upwards boost. So it's generally better to be moving upwards into one-ways whenever you're uncrouched as opposed to crouched. So for example, I'm in the platform now, so I'm getting the bonus velocity. But if I'm crouched here, I spend less time inside the one-way, so I get less of a boost. So another thing kind of weird with one-way platforms is that whenever you dash into the top half of them, you get a really wild upward snap if you do an upwards dash out of them. So for example, if I just do a normal dash towards like just a lower part of the wooden platform, or if I were to do it outside the wooden platform, it works as normal where I'm just, you know, moving at 240 speed with a little bit of upwards boost from the platform. But if I do it towards the top half of the platform, I start to dash here. You can see I get a pretty massive vertical spike there. My velocity is negative 480 here as opposed to negative 280. So if you're doing an up dash like in a section with these one-way platforms, sometimes it can be worth doing it in the top half and getting this massive boost. It's just kind of free height. It's especially really good in situations where you have two dashes and you're climbing. So 9-frame bunny hops are super underutilized and in a lot of cases can just be better than a super. So what a 9-frame bunny hop is a climb jump that retains all of your speed upon landing. So normally whenever you do a climb jump off a side of a wall and you want to land as soon as possible, 7 frames is optimal, but you don't retain any speed. So in some cases, retaining that extra speed can be worth it. So like right here, for example, we can jump here and activate this traffic block, because otherwise, if we just land 7 frames here and we don't have any extra speed, we're kind of screwed. Like, it takes us a really long time to accelerate and activate this traffic block. So this is a really good example of a place to use a 9-frame bunny hop, and just immediately later in the next room, you do a transition wall bounce right here, do a corner boost, and then you do another 9-frame landing, and you keep quite a bit of speed. It's not exactly a super, but it's just a little bit less than a super. And it's really, really good for maximizing both vertical and horizontal movement. It's kind of not entirely, again, not a new meta thing, but I think it's being applied a lot more, and it's something I think people should look at a lot harder. I think this is decently well known knowledge by this point, but I figured I'd include it just in case you don't know. Keep an eye out on when you can keep Coyote Time into bubbles. For example, here we can down right dash, hit the floor, and then up right into the bubble, and we can keep our Coyote Time into the bubble, so we can extend a demo dash here and do a demo hyper out of the bubble. This comes up kind of rarely, but it's really cute when it comes up. So I think this is just a pet peeve, but a piece of advice that really bothers me is that when people ask what levels they should look at to improve, they get told to look at ones with low re-record counts. I generally don't really like re-records as a metric. Rarely are they an accurate estimate to the optimization level of a task, because there's a lot of factors that come into play. The length of the task makes a big factor. The complexity of optimization makes a huge factor. Some task authors use a ton of re-records and some use relatively few, and it's just too many factors that get involved. That implies it's inaccurate in the first place and that it's always been tracking re-records. And for example, if somebody spends a bunch of time looking at a task and doesn't find any improvements, those re-records aren't going to get tracked typically. I know this isn't a super direct or helpful answer, but I would instead just kind of suggest looking at whatever you think seems fun or something that you think just seems improvable. I'll say as well, if you're an RTA runner or just are down to do that sort of stuff, something that's always been really helpful to me is just learn the RTA route of the level and just kind of improve the task from there. Without fail, every single level that I've ran, I've ended up finding something that I don't think I would have found otherwise. So this isn't really relevant to optimization quality, but I'm just going to speak my piece since I think this is going to be something that a lot of people end up seeing. But PSA, please stop using the repeat command for things that really, really don't need it. Try to save it for really long and tedious things, or just kind of play around and stuff like that. Please do not use the repeat command for things like water boosts or b-hop chains. The problem with doing that is that if you want to resync the tasks and the positioning is just a little bit off and you need to do like a crouch jump or something just to slow down a bit or anything like that, like a frame of neutral in the middle of the bunny hops or something, you have to break apart the repeat command and do a bunch of work from scratch, and it's just really, really annoying. It just makes tasks harder to read. Just please stop doing it. I'm going to kind of end this video here. There's definitely a lot more I could go into and a lot more small optimizations that I see people miss frequently, but I think it's kind of getting away from the macro level of what I wanted this video to exist to explain. And that's that you can do a lot of tasking without understanding a ton about really small, minor details of the game. And instead just kind of going in with an open mind and just looking for new stuff that you think people have never really explored. If you don't find something yourself, you can find something that somebody can help you improve to find some new secret sauce. And it's just a really fun part of tasking that I think is kind of underexplored, or at least not fully understood by some newer members. So I'd really encourage people to just, kind of pick up the task tools and just kind of mess around and try some stuff out. Don't just sit there and look at stuff that already exists and thinking how you can squeeze frames out of it. Just try wacky new stuff. It doesn't even have to be like super crazy or wacky again too. I say like wacky new stuff, but it can just be small little movement changes that just do basically the same thing but just a little bit better. That's all to say though that the two sides that I'm kind of talking about here, where it's like really tiny micro optimizations versus more like macro routing changes, they're definitely not mutually exclusive and you should know how to do both. But I do think there is a general sentiment that tasking has gotten super, super optimized now, and it's kind of true that it can be a little bit helpless if you're approaching things on a micro level, when instead there's still a ton of improvements to find just from strat changes and all this other stuff. And I would encourage more people to approach tasking in that way. Again, it's ideal if you can do both, but I think, at least personally, the macro level is way more interesting to me, and I want to see more people kind of jump on that train. But otherwise, I'm going to end the video here. Thanks for watching. If you have anything you found super confusing or wanted me to elaborate on, I might, make a continuation part of this. But until then, long live Archie. Peace.